Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on alternative proteins, which is sponsored by the Wellcome Trust. Delighted to see so many of you here. Today we're going to have a debate about alternative proteins. They're promoted as an alternative to animal source proteins as one of the solutions to help people switch from eating high amounts of meat to eating lower amounts of meat. Our session today is going to be looking at what are the different types of alternative proteins that are either on the market or in development. We've got 4 excellent speakers from around the world who are going to be giving us an introduction to them, and then we're going to open up for discussion and debate. We want to hear from you, different perspectives from different parts of the world. What do you think about these as a solution, about the proteins you hear? Are they going to work in your country, in your context? Would you eat them? So I'm going to welcome our panelists on stage. We have Professor Sir Charles Godfray from the University of Oxford, Dr. Alex Sexton, also from the University of Oxford. And then we've got Professor Marcel Dicke from Wageningen University and Dr. Ingrid van der Meer, also from Wageningen University. Welcome and have a seat. Great, thank you. So each of you is going to have 5 minutes to give us an overview of the different types of alternative proteins on the market. So Professor Sir Charles Godfray, can we start with you giving us an overview of lab meat?
Thanks very much, Modi. So Modi has asked me to introduce lab-based meat, and I'm very aware that probably some of the founders of this field are in the room. So I'm giving an overview, especially for people who are not that familiar with it. So people have been talking about artificial meat for actually over 100 years. And as a Brit, I do like to point out that Winston Churchill wrote about it in the 1950s, seeing it as a wonderful thing for the future. But artificial meat has become really interesting in the last 10 years, largely because of the developments in stem cell science and associated technologies. And I guess one of the, in 2013, Mark Post, in a wonderful coup de théâtre, then showed the first hamburger, beef burger, made from artificial meat in the wonderful event in the UK. A beef burger that was reputed to cost $300,000 in those days. So what is that animal meat? You start with a cell that hasn't differentiated it so far. You bathe it in the right kind of growth medium. You find it a structure upon which to grow. And certainly with current technology, using that, you can produce a meat product that can go into a sausage or a burger or something like that. And hopefully in the future, and especially as technology such as creating organs and understanding development goes on, then one will be able to produce something that really does look like a steak. It is a wild world out there among startups. There's a huge amount of interest in there and substantial venture capital money going into it. I guess the centers of this are the United States, Netherlands, and Israel, but in other countries as well. Names you will have heard of include Mozambique, which was set up by Mark Post, Memphis Meat, Finless Food, which is concentrating on substitutes for fish. The Just company, Meatable. Meatable is interesting because one of the problems with the growth medium in which you grow artificial meat is that currently most of it actually involves a product from an animal, fetal growth serum, and Meatable have a technology to avoid that. So that, in 2.5 minutes, is what the prospects for artificial meat. What are the consequences of it? So let me go through a couple of them. First of all, health. Well, actually, if you are really trying to make artificial meat and make it as similar as possible to ordinary meat, then you would expect the health effects to be roughly the same. But of course, the opportunities with artificial meat is that you can tweak things. You can reduce some of the negative consequences of, for example, red meat, which incidentally, and going back to what Harry was saying about big research questions, we still don't know enough about what those are, and you can possibly improve it, for example, putting in the right blends of fatty acids. And of course, if you are growing artificial meat in the lab, then you can avoid some of the food safety contaminations that can be a problem with ordinary meat. So there are some major advantages there. Environment, well, actually, so far, it's probably too soon to say about the environmental impacts. We did some analysis in Oxford, led by Marco Springman, who is in the audience. And our best figures at the moment shows that the greenhouse gas emissions from artificial meat are still quite high, certainly compared with alternative proteins based on plants and things. But of course, there is a lot that can be done there. And as it goes to scale, there are major opportunities for pushing that down. And there are some interesting twists. And again, we've done some work on this in Oxford about artificial meat will largely produce CO2, whereas livestock, ruminants, produce methane. They have different effects on the environment. One has to look quite subtly at what that is. The economics, again, the economics is not yet clear. And clearly, the economic advantages of scale will come into play big time as this begins to ramp up. So it's a bit unfair that artificial meat still gets targeted with this $300,000 price tag to it. I think there are enormous issues around acceptability. And Alex from Oxford, sitting to my left, has done some wonderful work looking at both the narratives and the counter-narratives for and against artificial meat. And one of the major positive narratives about artificial meat is that it is good for animal welfare. And then finally, the livelihoods. I think if we learnt anything from the populist surge that is sweeping around the world, is you have to look very carefully at the people who lose out. So I think if one is positive about artificial meat, then one has to look very carefully about what will happen to the people whose livelihoods will be affected or destroyed. And one has to be very, very careful about parts of the world where increasing meat consumption is just critical for people who have no other alternatives. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Alex, could you tell us about plant-based meats?
Yes. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I've been asked to give another sort of broad overview of plant-based meats. So what are they, how are they made, and some of the opportunities and challenges, just like Charles has done for cultured meat. So I thought I should probably begin with what is actually meant by plant-based, because this is a broad category. It can encompass lots of different products and lots of different methods, and sort of stretches across long histories, but then also has some recent innovations as well. What I am going to focus on in this talk is the plant-based meat, and how I'm distinguishing that are products that are trying to simulate or mimic animal products, so trying to be indistinguishable. You can't tell the difference when you're eating the plant-based versus the animal. So this is slightly distinct, well, not slightly, but it is distinct from maybe more traditional approaches such as tofu, seitan, which have long histories, sometimes as meat substitutes, but have these sort of long food cultures as well, but the sort of mimicry isn't quite as strong there, and also distinct from plant-based in their whole forms as well. So whilst all of these different plant-based categories are experiencing growth over the last few years, it's really these plant-based meats that are trying to mimic animal foods that are getting a lot of the hype, largely because there's this excitement that they could disrupt the global meat market and therefore have the biggest impact and also the biggest economic return as well. So some of the common ingredients that have been used for plant-based meat, so soya and wheat have been traditionally used. Mycoprotein as well, so companies like Quorn. Technically, that's not a plant, but they often and recently end up being part of the plant-based category. Charles likes to remind me that it's not a plant. So that distinction sometimes is lost, but we can maybe talk about the pros and cons of that. Pea is sort of having a moment. One of the benefits of pea is that it doesn't come with some of the allergen risks of soya and wheat, but some of the nutritional profile maybe isn't as complete as things like soya. And then some future trends that have been discussed have been things like seaweed and algae. So I think we can probably expect the plant-based ingredients behind these plant-based meats to probably keep expanding over the next few years. In terms of the processes, a lot of that is proprietary information, but generally it is a combination of things like heating, cooling, pressure, and then once you've done that, the reason for doing those things is to restructure the proteins to make that sort of meaty texture. Once you've done that, you can then cut, shape, and season them into the products that you want. More recent innovations in the production processes have involved things like the method that Impossible Foods is now using, the GM heme, so genetically engineering yeast cells to produce heme to provide that sort of plant blood to give that even bigger sort of meaty experience. So turning to the opportunities, you've probably heard a lot of hype in the media around, how these plant-based products cut across a lot of different fronts. The benefits sort of stretch across animal welfare, so removing animals from the meat system will have huge benefits for animal welfare. Environmental welfare, so a lot of the research done to date shows that generally it takes less inputs, environmental inputs, to create plants. Removing the animal, you're making that more of an efficient process. In terms of health benefits, this is both in terms of what these products contain, so perhaps higher protein, but also what they don't contain, so some of the saturated fats, etc., that you get with animal foods. And then also the promise of taste, so the promise that we don't have to give up our desire for meat. We can continue eating it without all of the bad stuff, I guess, that goes with animal products. Some of the challenges, so this is a lot of what my work looks at. So I think what we need to keep in mind is that a lot of these analyses are still relatively in their early days, and any gains that are being promised, particularly on the environmental side of things, will depend on the types of production systems that will be used. This does get into debates around land sparing and land sharing that maybe we could get into as well. The health benefits, I think it's important to distinguish between the healthiness of the plant-based ingredient versus the actual meal that it's being consumed as. So when we're talking about those benefits, that's really important to keep in mind. And then in terms of welfare, thinking beyond animals as well to things like social justice, livelihoods, rural communities, etc. I think we need to not just sort of, the animal is obviously important, but welfare does extend beyond that, and just removing the animal doesn't get rid of all of the ethical concerns embedded within the food system. So just finally, as some next steps that I think are important for this area, I think there has been a lot of research on consumer attitudes towards, will people eat plant-based meat alternatives? I think there needs to be more detailed research on what types of production systems will support this industry as it grows. I think there needs to be more research on whether these trends represent direct substitution between plant-based and animal, or if they'll end up being an addition. So that obviously has consequences for sustainability if it just leads to more consumption and more production. And then final point, I just want to reiterate this idea that plant-based doesn't always and automatically mean better. It very much depends on how it's done. So more critical research on that, I think, is good.
Great, thank you, Alex. Now on to you, Marcel. Please tell us about insects.
Okay. Yeah, I'll talk about insects, which are the most abundant life form on this planet. And the majority of species on this planet are insects. If we listen to the news, then we'll hear about the challenges that mankind faces in terms of climate change, feeding the world by 2050 when we have 9 to 10 billion people, conserving biodiversity, and still preserving health of human beings. When we talk about food, then it's quite often like we need more food. And I don't think we need more food, but we need different food. If we would produce more food in the same way we're doing now, then we would increase agricultural areas. That goes at the expense of nature. And so at the expense of nature, that means reducing biodiversity even further than the WWF already has told us recently on what the status is. If we increase production in the way we do it now, already agriculture contributes 25% to global change. If we do it in the same way, we'll only increase that. Insects are a form of life that we have exploited as food already as long as we exist. In prehistory, basically insects are the oldest protein source that humans have used. In the times we were hunter-gatherers, we already collected insects as well. Insects are a tremendous good protein source, and they can be produced in a much better way than we produce our current animal protein sources like livestock. If you produce insects at the moment, then you can do that at a very small ecological footprint. In terms of the amount of feed, they need 10 times less feeds to produce 1 kilogram of biomass than a cow does. So they're 10 times more efficient than a cow is. They do so with much less water and also with a much, much lower production of greenhouse gas emission. So in terms of climate change and in terms of feed intake, they need much lower amounts. What's even better is they can be reared on what we call waste streams. If we produce orange juice, the peels are left over. Now the peels go into landfills. We could also use them to produce insects on them. The insects that you produce this way have a very high quality. And so that's the other benefit that they have. They have a very high quality in terms of protein. They have the same amount of protein and same quality of protein that beef has. They have the right fatty acids, the polyunsaturated fatty acids. They have high levels of zinc and iron, and in this way can also mitigate health problems like anemia. In insects, we can use them even to rear them on waste streams and then feed them not only to ourselves, but also to chicken that by nature are insect eaters and not vegetarians. The chicken we eat now are forced to be vegetarians, whereas if you ask a chicken, they love to eat the insects. They don't get the chance. Yesterday I was at the opening of a big plant in the Netherlands that was opened by the king of the Netherlands of black soldier flies, a huge plant. I saw the king of the Netherlands put his hands in this bowl of larvae and he came out with them and looked at them and said, well, this is the protein of the future. Those kind of ambassadors I'd love to see. If we think of insects, well, are we eating them? Well, I have good news for everyone here. You already eat insects on a daily basis. And that's not because you open your mouth when you're riding your bike, but that's because you eat it when you eat any kind of processed food. Be that coffee, orange juice, tomato sauce, bread. There's always levels of insects in there, and you can calculate that everyone eats about 500 grams already at the moment. Then people ask me, well, should we really do that? And then I say, well, there's 2 billion people on this planet that have done this already. They're doing this at the moment. People especially living in the tropical areas. People that we should learn from. And I usually say we should not export McDonald's, but we should import the good ideas that people in these countries have. We should take their diet choices seriously. We should learn from them and incorporate that in what we're doing in other countries. If insects are being eaten in these countries, it's not because they're hungry. Sometimes I get that comment, oh, they're hungry and that's why they eat insects. No, they eat them because they're a delicacy. And a shrimp that we see as a delicacy and a locust is seen as a sky shrimp in many other countries, a delicacy that you wouldn't want to miss. And so insects are really the protein source of the future, and not because it's novel, but because we already did it for such a long time.
Great, thanks, Marcel. And finally, Ingrid, please do tell us about duckweed.
Yeah, so hello all. I would like to talk about duckweed. What is duckweed? I think you all might have seen it, maybe not knowing, because you can find duckweed everywhere in the world. It's actually the smallest flowering plant on Earth. It's a small plant floating on shallow water. It has a few leaves and a few roots hanging in the water. And it's a very special plant. It might be a new plant protein source. And why is it special? It has characteristics like a very high protein level on dry weight. It's about 40% with a very good amino acid profile comparable to soybean. It has minerals, a lot of vitamins, a high level of carotenoids, several specific flavonoids. But I think what makes it very special is how it is growing. So not like a normal plant, how it's producing from one plant you get seed, flower, seeds, and then you have more plants. But duckweed can grow exponentially because it does something which you find in microorganisms, for instance. It calls budding. So one plant just splits in two, and you have 2 plants, 2 splits in 4, 8 plants, so it really can grow exponentially. So a combination of this enormous high biomass production together with a high protein yield results in, for instance, that you could produce about 6 times more protein per hectare compared to soybean. And it doesn't need any good arable land. So it's a very nice plant. It is already eaten in certain parts of Southeast Asia, but not overall the world. So what's the problem there? And I think especially in Europe, it's seen as a novel food, meaning that we are not even allowed to use it for human nutrition. So we need to fill in a whole dossier with evidence showing that it's safe and submit it to the EFSA. And then if we have the right legislation, we could use duckweed as a new protein crop. So that's one type of the research that we've been doing, looking at whether it's toxic or not, if it's good digestible. But I think more important, what we also did was a consumer survey to check whether consumers would be willing to eat duckweed. And indeed they were, especially when you explain how sustainable you can grow this small plant, and what a nice plant it is, and what nice features it has. But we also performed several intervention studies with volunteers, showing that it's very good digestible, that the proteins are digested good and taken up, comparable to other leafy crops. But also a nice intervention study was where we really made meals with duckweed and compared them to the same meals made with spinach, like quiche or lasagna with duckweed or risotto. And we gave that to volunteers for 2 weeks in a row. And the nice results were that they were as highly appreciated as the spinach meals. And the people, after eating 2 weeks duckweed, they didn't get any abdominal pain or whatever. So it's very well accepted. So that's, I think, the challenges now are to submit this dossier and to get it granted, and that we can really use this for human nutrition. And a very interesting feature, I think, is that duckweed would be perfect for vertical farming. So imagine that you grow it in shallow water in 5 layers with LED lights, indoors, very controlled. You could even produce 30 times more protein per hectare compared to soybean. So, and together with mechanical harvesting, that would be a very perfect method to produce new proteins. So I think that's one of the challenges. Another interesting thing is that you could use it as a fortified food, because duckweed can take up minerals and metals very easy from the medium that they're growing on. So you can produce fortified food with iron or selenium for specific groups of consumers. And I think the health-promoting components that are present in duckweed, for me, they're also very interesting, because they're interesting health-promoting compounds present. So it could be more than just a new protein source.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all of you for those brilliant introductions. So we've heard about 2 different types of alternative proteins on the stage today. We've heard about neglected proteins, which are things like the insects and plants like duckweed, which people currently aren't really consuming very much of, but could be a potential source of protein in place of meat and animal source foods. And then we've also heard about the new innovative products on the market. Well, some of them have been around for a long time, as Alex told us, like tofu. But then there's, new and emerging plant-based meats, and then also lab-based meat, which could be a protein for the future. So over to you guys. What do you think about the alternative protein debate? Are any of you eating them? What's their role in this debate? Thank you. We've got a question over there. Is there a mic? Perhaps if you just speak up. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Heather Mills from Bioscience Foods. We're the largest producers of breadth of plant-based products in the world. We have 600,000 square feet of manufacturing facilities. I'm particularly interested in your duckweed because we have a lot of land where we grow algae, microalgae, that we make into tuna and fish, and it has the highest level DHA and EPA of all the algae. we're quite a dark secret. We've only just sort of come above the parapet in the last year. And I was just very interested in a couple of things. First of all, do you feel that microalgae deliver the best form of protein, more than insects and the other alternates that you're talking about? Do you think that's the future? We make everything from soy, from pea protein. We've been doing it for 26 years. So we're already been making those for a long time. So most of this stuff that people are talking about, it's great that you're bringing it to the forefront. But do you think algae is more efficient than duckweed?
Now, maybe I'm biased, but the research that we have performed on algae, we find it's very difficult to get the proteins available. So it's difficult to sort of crack the algae in order to digest the proteins. Also, if you want to isolate, extract proteins, it's much more difficult to get them out of algae or seaweeds, macroalgae, compared to duckweed. So duckweed is very easy to sort of break open, but also for human digestion and for animal digestion, it's easier to digest duckweed compared to microalgae.
I mean, obviously seaweeds are completely different because they have a much lower DHA, much lower DHA, and every algae comes in different varieties. But I'd love to speak to you afterwards about the duckweed because that's new to me. And then on the insects, just a personal question. What do you know about the effect of the insects you're using as far as disease is concerned, like Lyme disease and things like that? And what science have you done on the tests of insects when people eat them, and whether they're sitting in the cell, because you can't find out what's going on in the body by blood. It's only from the urine, and a lot of people have Lyme disease from insects. So I just wondered how you isolate all that. Is that just because it's grown in an isolated area?
Lyme disease is caused by ticks that live outside and that live on mice and deer. They don't live on insects indoors. When we grow insects, then that's done under the same conditions, good health conditions, that we also rear our poultry or pigs in. And so it's controlled conditions, and they need to meet with all the conditions that regular food also needs to meet with. And so there's no risk of diseases, and there's less risk of diseases even than with conventional meats, because a pig and we share the same kind of diseases. An insect is so different from us that even if insects have diseases, but diseases of insects have a very tiny chance of being the same as a disease that we can face.
Okay, so
great,
it's
thank
isolated.
you.
Thank you.
Give others an opportunity to ask questions. But whilst I'm waiting to see any hands, yes, thank you. Anyone else? We'll take perhaps 2 or 3 at the same time. So over there, and then over here.
Want die microfoon hebben?
And was there one this end? Okay, we can start here, and then there'll be one over there.
The 18 Foundation. Quick question. The meat lobbying are using the idea of glyphosate as a stick to beat against plant-based foods. I was wondering if you would like to elaborate on that as a topic.
Can we take 2 or 3 questions at the same time just to get maximum audience participation? Thank you. There was one over there, and then we'll go to the gentleman at the back. So.
My question, Redette Institute, New Zealand, and Fonterra. My question is, how do we get the scientific answers to allow for the ecosystem change? We talk about the big transformation, rather than a lot of, if you want, disjointed or disparate pieces of information around different, be it insect, be it cellular, be it cultured, and so on. And how do we look at that with traditional sources of nutrition as we have today, plus the disruptive ones? Because my comment is not a question, but I fear we will end up suboptimal unless we have those answers. How are we going to do that quickly enough?
Thank you. And one more question in the middle.
Hi. Just in your research on alternative proteins, have you guys explored whether there's a necessity for alternative proteins? Whether there's even if we were to reduce meat consumption by 50%, isn't the world already sort of protein rich enough, or is there a need for all of this?
Thank you. So our 4 panelists. The 3 questions we've had was one around glyphosate and the meat industry, one around how do we bring together all this disparate information of different types of traditional and alternative proteins. It was a comment, but if you might have reflections on those. And then the 3rd question, are these necessary alternative proteins?
Shall I go first and attempt the question from the gentleman from Fonterra, as I'm half New Zealand? Fonterra being the major dairy producer, wonderful organisation in New Zealand. I think that's a really interesting point. I think that sometimes we think about, you sometimes hear the phrase that there is land that is used for meat production that could be used for no other purpose. And although that may be strictly true for producing food, I do think we need to take a broader view of the multiple purposes of land, multifunctional landscapes, for recreation, for carbon storage and things like that. And so I would agree with you, one needs to take a whole ecosystem approach. I think that sometimes we have a shifting baseline of what we think our agriculture is, and I know that very much from living and working in the UK, that we think that some of our uplands must be for sheep farming because we think they've always been sheep farming. Actually, it's only 200 or 300 years. Certainly from where you come from in New Zealand, your dairy and sheep land is much, much younger than that. So I think we have to have the flexibility and think creatively about what we're going to use for our land. The old joke is that we're not making it anymore, except my colleagues from Holland who are. And to think much more holistically about how we use the land for multiple things, including producing protein. And I completely agree to take an ecosystem approach.
I can just add on that as well. So part of our research that we've done around the narratives, around the alternatives, but also some of the counter-narratives from the existing livestock industry is you can do that analysis and sort of put them as this binary of alternatives versus existing industry, but actually when you do a deeper analysis, what you find is a shared set of hopes, concerns and values about what we think the food system should look like and what we think it should look like moving forward. And I think that there's a lot of room there to concentrate on those shared themes. And they might be coming from different backgrounds and different arguments, but concentrating on that middle ground, I think, is a much more productive space rather than polarizing the debates as sort of farmers versus vegans or technophiles versus technophobes. So yeah, staying in that middle ground, I think, is more productive.
I will take on the question on the necessity. When I said that insects are much more efficient in producing high-quality meat, then I didn't mean that we need to add more, but that we need a transition and that we need to change our systems. We should not add to the food system that we have, but we should change our transition, our food system. And the other day I was talking to a chicken farmer who is now changing into becoming a cricket farmer in the Netherlands. And that's the kind of changes that I'd like to see, that we're changing what we're eating. But that requires not only that a farmer makes that decision, it also requires that food producers need to make this transition. They need to make new products with that. They need to engage consumers. They need to engage society as a whole. So there's a multifaceted change that we need to go through. And I think that's a fascinating change that we need, but we should not put it on the plate of any individual, but we should do that together. And I was very happy when I saw this farmer that's making this transition as a farmer, and I would be more than willing to help him in making that transition also a viable option.
Yeah, I would like to add to that indeed we need to make this protein transition. But when you look at the industrial world, we are already eating too much protein. So indeed, we should go down in the protein consumption. We can go down for 40% and still have enough. So there are many things that need to be changed. Not only that we replace meat proteins by plant proteins, and then it would be good to have more plant protein sources, or little insects, little cattle, let's say. But so the transition need to be at many different levels. And indeed, I think we need, it's for sure that there will be a shortage of protein as such in the future. So we need to find solutions for that.
Thank you. Does anyone want to take the glyphosate question? Otherwise, we'll take a few more.
So as I understand, you're referring to the possible carcinogenic effects of glyphosate. So we need more evidence to understand the reality of that. And I think that the use of glyphosate for main plant crops is just so much greater than for the foreseeable future for plant crops that might be used for artificial protein. It's probably a relatively minor effect.
Great. We've got 5 more minutes, so I'll take 3 more questions, but they have to be very brief, and we'll have very brief responses. Let's see if we can do this.
Where's the microphone?
The microphone is here. We'll take the lady at the back. Yes, and then the lady on the right over here. I'm going to go for just women, and then the lady at the front.
Okay, I'm the lady in the back. From Sweden. I have a comment about that we have a high protein intake. As I said, we can lower the protein intake, and the challenge is not to lower the protein intake. The tricky thing is to lower the protein intake without lowering the intake of magnesium, calcium, iron, and selenium, and so on. So I think it's important not to talk only about the protein, but protein sources.
Thank you.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Question over here.
Thank you. My name is Helen from the Netherlands. I run a campaigning agency that is working on food transition as well. And I was wondering, what are the biggest barriers, but also opportunities to convey people of choosing these products? In some cases, a bit controversial or new. So what are the biggest barriers and opportunities to
Thank you. And then
seduce people?
One question at the front, and then we'll take quick answers.
Sorry, my question was very similar to that one. Is public acceptability the biggest barrier to these alternative meats, particularly the duckweed and the insects? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we've got a question around quality of proteins and any risks of micronutrient deficiencies if people cut back, and then what are the opportunities and barriers?
I suspect we'd all agree with the lady at the back there.
Yeah.
We just agree with you.
Great, thank you.
For sure.
I can speak on the sort of plant-based and cultured meat for the consumer acceptability. I think it depends on which consumers you're talking about. Are they the meat eaters or people who are already reducing or completely abstaining from meat? If it's meat eaters, then it depends how much they value notions of real food, naturalness, and that maybe turns them off to things like cultured meat because of its association with labs, although when production potentially gets scaled up, it wouldn't be in a lab, but that's, we can talk about that afterwards. Price, as always, is one of the biggest drivers and barriers to people choosing food, as well as convenience, so availability of the products. But I think also, if it is meat eaters that are the target audiences, then the types of product, being able to deliver that meaty experience, and particularly larger cuts of meat. So for a lot of the plant-based products that are currently on the market, tend to be very good at simulating minced meat, or even chicken chunk kind of products. Getting to the sort of steaks sort of territory, could be a bigger ask for the more enthusiastic meat eaters. So they're just some of the barriers.
Well, when it comes to barriers and the public, then of course with insects you need to do your best to get the audience to really change things, especially when we have been taught so long that insects are yucky animals that we need to kill with pesticides. And the first thing that people do when they see a 6-legged animal in their garden is to go to the garden center and buy neonicotinoids. But then when neonicotinoids are being used to produce food, then that's not done. So we need to change the attitude, but we also need ambassadors for that. That's why I gave the example of the King of the Netherlands, but also someone like Angelina Jolie, whose children love insects. And when, well, they can't be enough in the news. I love to see a football player advocating that insects are good. We need ambassadors, but we also need good products that people really want to eat desperately because they like them. And so that's why it's a multifaceted thing that we need to do.
Yeah, I agree on that. So for duckweed, we did this survey, and it's very important to explain about sustainability, but more important to make good products that are really tasty. And it might be easier because duckweed looks like spinach indeed, and so it's less of a hurdle. But explaining how it's produced and making good products, that's key, I think.
That's great, thank you. So, quick poll with the audience. Has anyone here been persuaded to eat insects who previously didn't eat them knowingly before? Hands up. Not bad. About, I'd say, maybe a third to half. We've still got to work on the rest of you. But thank you very much for attending this session. Thank you so much to the panelists for your excellent contributions. Give you a round of applause.
Thank you, Modi.
Thank you.